Hey everybody, in this video I wanted to talk about the modes, but I want to keep it specifically in the context of what I guess we would broadly call jam band music. I know people kind of recoil at that term, jam band, but I'm referring to music by the Grateful Dead, Phish, the Allman Brothers, newer bands like Spafford and Goose are using the modes extensively as kind of a source code for improvising with, so to speak. And that's actually kind of an important point to make right out of the gate, is that the modes actually mean different things to different types of musicians. For example, like a classical musician wouldn't really think of the modes all that often. It does come up occasionally, but it's not a major part of what they do. Jazz musicians are certainly aware of the modes and use them here and there, but there's usually, in most jazz, there's way too many chord changes for the modes to be super useful. The modes do show up here and there in like country and bluegrass guitar, but it's more the exception than the rule, I would say, and most players in those styles aren't super aware of the modes when they're playing. And I do see the modes here and there, more than here and there, pretty often in music by shredder-type guitar players like Eric Johnson or Joe Satriani. Frank Zappa used the modes quite a bit in his guitar solos too. But for the most part, for jam band type guitar players, the modes are super important, right? The modes mainly apply when you're working with a jam that's over either a single chord or like a short chord progression that repeats over and over. That's where the modes really become the most useful. If there's a lot of chord changes that you're soloing over, the modes don't really work all that well. It's best when it's just a simple little progression or even just a single chord. So I guess the first thing we'll want to do is just define what a mode is. Now this is intended as just kind of a basic intro overview video for the modes, so I don't want to get real deep into the weeds of any kind of music theory with it. So suffice it to say for now that a mode really is a scale that's derived from another scale. That's kind of a technical definition of what a mode is. You can basically think of a mode as a scale in and of itself. If you want to, it really doesn't matter. It's a group of notes, let's put it that way. And if you've investigated the modes at all, you might have read that, the modes are a major scale, but starting on a different point within the scale or something like that. And that's kind of true. It's definitely not false anyway. But it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't actually tell you that much about how the mode functions or what it sounds like. And it's also kind of a lot to think about if you're like on the fly in the middle of the jam. You don't want to be thinking, okay, well, I'm in this major scale, so yada yada. It gets a little complicated to think about all of that. What I really think is the most important aspect of the modes, or what really defines them, is that each mode is a sound. Each mode has its own unique sound. And when you're using that sound as like an improvisational background, you think of each mode's sound as sort of its own color palette, and when you're improvising within that color palette, you're improvising within that sound. So there are really two different things in my mind that make up what defines that sound. First of all, it's sort of the primary chord that you're playing over, or the home chord, the chord that defines what key you're in. And then, so that's the first half of it, and then the other half of it is the other notes or chords that appear along with that primary chord. And so when it comes down to it, our primary chords can be divided into one of two major categories, major or minor. We've either got a major key jam or a minor key jam. There is one mode, the Locrian mode, that actually corresponds to diminished chords, but it's pretty rare that you would ever sit on a diminished chord for more than a couple of beats in a song. It's not a type of chord that you sit on for very long. So we can kind of forget about the Locrian mode. All the other modes correspond to either a major chord or a minor chord, and it happens that there's three each. There's three major modes and three minor modes. Now, broadly speaking, I guess you would say that jam band type music tends to be happier music, so probably major shows up more often than minor, certainly with the Grateful Dead and Phish anyway, which are the ones I happen to be the most familiar with. And overwhelmingly, in that world, major key jams tend to be in the Mixolydian mode. I'd say maybe 80% of the major key jams are in Mixolydian, and the other 20% might be split between the other two major modes, which would be Ionian and Lydian. Minor key jams are overwhelmingly in the Dorian mode. There are a few exceptions to it here and there, but it's probably more like 90% of them tend to go more for the Dorian mode than any of the others, the other two being Aeolian and Phrygian. So anyway, back to Mixolydian, since I think it's probably the most common. There's a big giveaway that happens in almost every single Mixolydian jam you see, and that is that it starts on a major chord, say A, and then you see another major chord a whole step down, which would be G in this case, or you'd be in the key of D, but you'd also see a C chord, or you'd be in E, and there would also be a D chord. That's the big giveaway that's in almost any Mixolydian jam you'll see. So let's run down a few examples from the Grateful Dead and Phish worlds, because like I said, those are the ones that I personally know the best. So Mixolydian jams in Phish Town would be Down with Disease, which goes A to G, A, G, D actually. Theme from the bottom goes D, C, G, so D to C. We Could Paw Groove also is D, C, G. It goes a little faster, right? Gotta Chaboo is in E, and it goes back and forth from E to D. The jam in Backwards Down the Number Line is in G, and then it goes to an F chord, then a C chord. Bathtub Gin is a little bit of an exception, so it's in the key of C. And you would be looking for a B flat chord, right, in the examples that I've been giving. In this case, we have more like a G minor 7 chord. Well, it happens that G minor is the relative minor of B flat, so in a jamming context, they're effectively almost the same thing. In fact, you can even physically see, like, this is a G minor 7 chord. This is a B flat chord. Almost the same exact chord. So Bathtub Gin goes C to G minor 7. On the Grateful Dead side of things, Fire on the Mountain is about as Mixolydian as a jam's going to get. It's in B, and then it goes back and forth to an A chord, right? The ending jam of Deal is in A, and it goes to a G chord and then a D chord. Franklin's Tower is also A, G, D, goes faster than that, right? Dark Star, the ultimate modal jam, right? That one is basically a big A chord, but in Bob Weir's rhythm guitar part, you also hear a little bit of a G chord, and then kind of like an A sus4 chord, which is not much different than a D chord, by the way. So in some ways, Dark Star is actually not that much different than Franklin's Tower, right? Birdsong is another big jam that's in Mixolydian. It's mainly a big E chord, but the melody, there's a D triad right there in the main melody, resolving back to an E chord. And there's plenty of other jams by both bands that are Mixolydian as well. Now, as for the Ionian mode, it is a little less common, but it definitely shows up quite a bit. I'd say the big clue for Ionian is that it's in a major key and you don't see that major chord a whole step down. So if the jam is in D, for example, you're not going to see a C chord in the Ionian mode. So on the Phish side, Harry Hood is the big Ionian jam, right? That's D, A, G. There aren't too many other Phish jams in Ionian, but there's a couple that I can think of, like Yamar goes A, F sharp minor, B minor, E. And the ending jam of Fluffhead goes G, A minor, C, D, I think, right? On the Dead side, the big Ionian jam is over that E major 7 chord in Eyes of the World. And so the intro and outro jams of Eyes of the World are Ionian all the way. The middle two jams actually do have a chord change in them that forces you to step out of the Ionian mode. But yeah, the intro and outro jams with that major 7 chord are Ionian all the way. Also on the Dead side, I would think of Friend of the Devil as very Ionian sounding. Just straight down the G major scale with that bass line, right? The ending jam of Crazy Fingers is also very Ionian sounding. To see all the way, but it sounds very pretty in Ionian, right? So the third major mode that we haven't talked about yet is Lydian, and I actually think the Lydian is a super cool sounding mode. It doesn't make quite as many appearances as the others in the Dead or Phish catalogs, but it definitely shows up in a few places. The big giveaway to me for Lydian is that it starts on a major chord and then you see another major chord a whole step above. So on the Phish side, that would be the Curtain Width, which is in E flat, but it kind of pops up to an F chord for a few beats. The Reba jam is the same 2 chords. And I don't know the song Wingsuit, but I'm pretty sure I hear Lydian in that song too. And in fact, once you learn the sound of Lydian, you'll realize it's a pretty distinctive sound, and I'm pretty sure I hear it going on there. On the Dead side, we don't see a ton of Lydian mode, but we do see a couple examples of it. Lady with a Fan is in F, and you can hear that G triad, right, a whole step above. You can kind of hear that in like the rhythm guitar part, right? So it's kind of the sound of that G chord sort of superimposed over the F. We also see Lydian mode in those short little jams in Saint of Circumstance, where it's like a B flat, but kind of a C triad imposed over that B flat. Now, as for minor modes, we have three possibilities, right? We have the Dorian mode, the Phrygian mode, or the Aeolian mode. And like I said before, Dorian mode is overwhelmingly the one that people go to for jamming in minor modes. The big sort of giveaway for a Dorian jam to me, although it's interesting, I don't see a ton of examples of this in the Dead and Phish catalogs, but to go from a minor chord to a major chord up a fourth, so A minor to D major, is very much a cliche Dorian progression to me. That's like Oye como va. And it's also In Memory of Elizabeth Reed by the Allman Brothers. On the Phish side, the You Enjoy Myself jam goes from a G minor to a C, actually like a C7 or a C9, right? And Cross-Eyed and Painless is another example I can think of this, where it's in B minor, but you can hear a bunch of E chord in the guitar. It's not really moving the whole band to an E chord, but the guitar kind of indicates an E chord. A lot of minor key jams will go from a minor chord to a major chord a whole step down, like E minor to D. This would be, in the Phish catalog, this would be the David Bowie jam. Or the Run Like an Antelope. On the Dead side, the other one basically has that same chord progression. And then on the Phish side especially, there's a lot of minor key jams that are really just one single chord. And technically any of the three minor modes could be used over a single minor chord, but really, again, Dorian is the big go-to mode. This would be like Sand. Birds of a Feather jam. The Mike's Song jam. And on the Dead side, they actually don't have a ton of big jams that are straight minor, but the Playing in the Band jam is one example I can think of, right? The song is basically a D major, but then the jam tends to go into more of a D minor kind of territory. So Aeolian is probably the next most common mode for minor key jams. It doesn't show up very often at all. There are a couple of sort of cliche giveaways for jams that are in the Aeolian mode. One, you might have a minor chord followed by a minor chord off of the fourth, so like A minor to D minor. Or the other one that you see a lot would be a minor chord, then down a whole step to a major chord, and then down another whole step to another major chord. So that'd be like A minor, G, F. Right, that's like the Stairway to Heaven solo. Or in B minor, A, G is the progression to All Along the Watchtower, which the Grateful Dead did cover. And I think on the Dead side that Estimated Prophet kind of leans towards an Aeolian sound over that F-sharp minor jam. I know Bob Weir's rhythm guitar part is F minor, but it has a little indication of a B minor chord in there, so that's that minor chord off of the fourth. And like I said, I was not able to think of a single Phish song that's even in the Aeolian mode. The Phrygian mode is probably the least common of all the modes that we've talked about. It does make one appearance that I can think of in the Grateful Dead catalog and not a single one in the Phish catalog. The big giveaway for Phrygian is that you'd have a minor chord and then you'd go up just a half step to a major chord. So that would be like F sharp minor to G, which is pretty much the chord progression that we see in Lost Sailor. Phrygian has a pretty unique sound to it. Now, there's a couple things I should add about the modes. Phish, for example, is very adept at changing modes in the middle of a jam. So just because they started in one mode does not mean that they're going to finish in that mode. Phish is very good at that, but it's also true in a Grateful Dead jam like Dark Star or Playing in the Band. They can get so far out from home that it really isn't in that original mode anymore, although usually eventually these jams do kind of come back to where they started. But so it is a little flexible, right? A good band can listen to each other and respond to each other and drift into other places, so you're not stuck in one of these modes if you start jamming in one of these modes. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that there are a bunch of jams in both bands' catalogs where it's not real clear whether they're in major or minor. And I kind of have a broad category that I put a lot of these jams into, which I consider sort of blues. And our typical rules of major and minor don't exactly apply in the blues. And so Phish, we have some jams where this appears. This would be like Chalk Dust Torture, or maybe 46 Days, where it's not really clear whether they're even in major or minor. And to me, that's almost a characteristic of blues, is that it's a little ambiguous whether it's major or minor. And that's kind of like almost the defining characteristic of the sound of blues. So that's a big topic, and I do want to delve into that, but I'm going to save it for another video. And of course, the Grateful Dead, by the way, have a ton of songs that are straight up blues, and some that I would say are bluesy. You know, Viola Lee Blues, or Truckin' is pretty bluesy sounding, or New Speedway Boogie is basically a blues sound. So our usual modal rules don't exactly apply in these contexts. Lastly, I'll say that there are other modes that we derive from the harmonic minor or melodic minor scales, as opposed to the ones we talked about here today, which are all derived from the major scale. Those are mainly reserved for jazz. There are a couple examples in the Phish catalog of these modes, but they're pretty rare, and that's kind of another level of this topic, so I'm going to save that for later too. So that's just kind of an overview of the modes and what they sound like and where they apply in the music of the Grateful Dead and Phish and other jam bands. So if you're ready to do a deeper dive on that, check out the Modes Workshop on my website. There's also a bunch of backing tracks where you can kind of play along with them and hear this stuff in action.